Good evening. My name's Adam Davis, and on behalf of Oregon Humanities, I want to say a big welcome to what I think is our third 2018 Portland Think and Drink. So thanks for making it out for this. Before we do anything else, I would like to say a big welcome to David Rogers, Rene Denfeld, and Bobbin Singh. Thank you for joining us this evening. So the overarching theme of the year has been race, power, and justice, and this evening we're going to be exploring alternatives to criminal justice system as it is, and I think as it might be. And you know a little bit about these three, or a lot about these three. I'm not going to say too much, except that David Rogers with ACLU, Rene Denfeld has been a death penalty investigator, sex trafficking investigator, has written a couple of really beautiful and challenging novels related to these themes, and Bobbin Singh is with the Oregon Justice Resource Center. We are really lucky to have the three of you together to talk about this stuff. Having said that, I'm going to ask for just a few minutes to set how we got here, and then we'll jump in. We'll take about an hour talking, and then we'll invite questions from a microphone over here. And then we're going to, when the formal program ends, we will encourage you to stay and talk to each other for a while and eat food and continue to drink if that's something you like to do here. But we'll encourage you to stay and talk to each other for a while. So that's the shape of the evening. Before we jump in, I guess I want to say a big thanks to Tonkin Torp and Stoll Reeves for helping get this program going, and especially Jeff Cron and Emily Carr with those two organizations. I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, which continues to be in decent shape despite rumors to the contrary, and also the Oregon Cultural Trust, which makes events like these possible all around the state. And then I want to say a big thanks to the Advisory Committee for Think and Drink. There are a number of people sitting here, some of whom bashfully looking away right now, but I just want to say a big thanks for helping us think through this and make this arrangement of events possible. That said, I think we're going to jump in. And we are going to be thinking forward into what we might imagine the criminal justice system could be, but I was hoping we could start by moving back first. And I wanted to ask each of you in a way to talk a bit about maybe when and how the idea of prison or jail, or whatever we call it, started to register for you as young people. If you can remember how it started to show up as a thing and make an impression on you. And I wonder, Bobbin, if anything pops to your mind there.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for having us. And it's an honor to share the stage with David and Rene. I think I feel kind of lucky to be in with those two. A little out of place, but extremely lucky to be here.
No.
But I think for me, really what happened is my parents immigrated here from India in the late 60s. I was born and raised in a Sikh family, wore a turban, was born and raised in Atlanta and grew up in the South. And I experienced racism, bigotry, prejudice from as early as I can remember. Being told to go back to our country, you don't belong here, being discriminated in businesses, so on and so forth. And I joke that being raised in Atlanta, like the first names that you remember or that you learn are like John Lewis, Andy Young, MLK, because the civil rights movement was there in Atlanta, the history is there. So I really became sort of attracted to those figures, that movement, and really started to try to appreciate and understand, how people stood up to racism, bigotry. And the thing that really stood out to me is that I don't think there's anything more perverse, horrifying, disgusting than when your government, whether it's the state or federal government, discriminates against you, oppresses you, subjects you to cruel and unusual punishment. And I think once you start thinking about those issues in that way, and then you begin to look at the criminal justice system, prisons and jails, and how we treat people who are charged and arrested with crimes, how it disproportionately impacts certain communities, and how the criminal legal system is really used to sort of control populations or people that we don't want, how it is a manifestation of white supremacy and institutional racism. Once you start looking at that and seeing that and being exposed to the criminal justice system and these issues, it's very hard, I think, for anyone to turn away from it. And so as I started, growing up and experiencing both discrimination from individual citizens, but I've had many encounters with law enforcement. After the Iraq War, it was racial profiling that occurred. After 9/11, more racial profiling. I was always randomly selected at the airport for searches. But I think it's just that, how the government treats people that we don't like. And that's really what I think the criminal justice system is about, fundamentally.
Rene, I don't know, as you think back, when prison started to register as an idea or a thing.
I'll share some stuff I've written about as well, and I'm pretty open about my own past. My first experience with prisons and jails was when I was 9, and the man I consider my father was sentenced. He's a registered predatory sex offender. And I have a vivid memory of being in the courtroom and watching him get led away. And I think that later just led to this very heartfelt and passionate commitment and questioning I have of what is justice. As a survivor and as a victim, but also as an advocate who came from an African-American family and has experienced a lot of the discrimination and racism that's out here. So I eventually got into death penalty work. I ended up working as a chief investigator for a while at the public defender's office. And, it's been profoundly redemptive work for me. It's partially understanding. I want to understand why. Why do some people commit bad things? Why do we end up actually imprisoning the people who are less likely to be guilty? Because who ends up in prison and jail in our country actually has very little to do with their actions. So I'm really fascinated with all the ways in which we are failing, actually, to create a justice system in our society that it works. And I also take a great deal of pleasure in working, not just with the victims, but actually I take a lot of pleasure in working with the offenders. I would love to see us create a model of justice where there's a chance of redemption and change and prevention as well.
And maybe we can we'll keep going into that for sure, yeah.
For sure, on those values, absolutely. One of the early drivers for me in terms of getting involved in working around criminal justice was when I was in my late teens. A cousin of mine was beaten really, really badly by multiple police in front of his parents in his front yard. He is a gentle, gentle soul, one of the most gentle souls that I know. And he spent a week in the hospital. There was no justice there. And that was a real motivator for me to start organizing. And at the time, I was living in Western Massachusetts around police accountability. And the organization I was organizing with, we were focused on trying to create an independent police review board. We made very little progress, actually, in about a year and a half of hard work. And then we realized we really actually have no idea what's going on, in terms of most effective strategies. And so we started talking to people who are doing criminal justice reform around the country. And that's actually when my understanding of mass incarceration and prison industrial complex really grew, which is that I started from police accountability, and then my analysis grew much wider. But I will just say, what happened to my cousin was fundamentally said to me, this is a system that is supposed to keep us safe. I mean, the justice system, the institutions like police departments are somehow built on this narrative that their existence keeps us safe, and yet that was laid bare, that is not at all what's happening, and in fact, that very little has, building safe and healthy communities has very little to do, in fact, nothing to do with building and filling prisons, right? Like we know, in fact, that to a large degree, a focus on incarceration makes us less safe, which maybe we can talk more about.
Yeah, it'd be great to go further into it, in a way, pushing towards, well, what is this system for? And you just suggested some expectation that it's for keeping communities safe. And I guess I'd want to just put that question back explicitly, both, maybe for starters even, what is the prison system for? The justice system for, if you were going to boil it down? And I know there's both an is and a ought to be, but maybe starting with the is.
Yeah, in what it really is in practice. You know, I think in my experience, in Oregon, you know, I think right now we have more prisons than we do colleges, universities. We were talking earlier, there's, you know, right now I think in the United States, 1 in 4 Americans now has a criminal record. And that makes it almost impossible to find housing or work. You know, I think one thing that we need to examine is, and when we're talking about what are prisons for, is there is an economy of oppression. Right now, prisons in the United States are a huge provider of prison slave labor. You know, they sew the uniforms at McDonald's. If you buy Victoria's Secret, you don't have to tell me if you do. I don't need to know, you know, what you're wearing. But, you know, they make those underwear. They put together the phones. They farm. 1 in 3 wildland firefighters is an inmate. So, you know, there's a huge economic incentive for incarcerating. And so I think that's one of the things that they're for. And to be really honest, I think that they're also for a lot of covert and overt racism. And, you know, we're committing genocide in this country. We're committing genocide against people of color. And this is the way we're getting rid of them. These prisons are, you know, you go into prisons like internment camps. And we're erasing, like right now, what would this room look like if we weren't incarcerating so many of our African American citizens in Portland? You know, our world would look so much different. So I'm really interested in, like, what are the real deep motives behind these things? Because again, it doesn't really have to do with keeping us safe. It's not really about helping victims either.
Yeah, so social control, political control, all of the felony disenfranchisement laws around the country that mean that if you have a felony conviction, you no longer have the ability to vote. So when you have 1 in 3 black men in this country who actually have lost their ability to vote because of felony disenfranchisement laws, it's about political and social control of certain communities.
And if they had been able to vote, we probably wouldn't have Trump.
For real. Yeah.
I mean, I think what Rene and David said is absolutely correct. I think it's about control, oppression, dealing with populations and problems that we don't really want to deal with. It's a simple solution to the complex world that we live in. We oversimplify mental health, we oversimplify racism, we oversimplify addiction and substance abuse, and we use our criminal justice system to try to deal with those problems in a very simple way. And what we end up doing is actually compounding those problems. And I think that's really what we're saying when we're saying it's not something that actually helps with public safety or is meant to improve public safety, because we take people who are fundamentally, you know, have some complexities in their lives and then re-traumatize them, re-expose them, or expose them to additional types of systems that just exacerbate those issues.
But it's also, so all of that, yeah, but that safety narrative has been built to essentially prop it up, right? And so it's been built in this narrative that there are these monsters out there that people should be afraid of, that society needs to be protected from, and we've seen that narrative develop in multiple ways. It's advanced the policies that drive mass incarceration, right? We saw that there was pseudo-social science in the early 90s that created the myth of the youth super predator, right? The like young black and brown men who are gonna come and like out of the cities and into the suburbs and rain havoc and rape and pillage, and it was that the myth of the super predator, right, was actually what then drove the proliferation of mandatory minimum sentences, which is one of the largest drivers of mass incarceration. It drove the policies like we have in Oregon, Measure 11, that treat 15, 16, and 17-year-olds automatically as adults in the criminal justice system as soon as they're charged. These are these notions of these monsters that the system needs to protect us from are well-developed myths, and that also are fundamentally about advancing racism as well.
So,
Absolutely.
go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in that because I completely agree. I think what our society has done is we want to other people. Mm-hmm. And we've created the myth of the monster. Doing the death penalty work for years, I've worked with a lot of people who, part of what we do actually is exonerations. There's investigators like myself have now exonerated over 250 innocent people off death rows. Thank you. But the difficult subject is, what about when people are actually guilty? What do we want to do with people that are guilty in our society? This is a really important question. And in our society, there's just so much anger and so much hostility and rage that is directed at people that have even committed minor offenses. And I think we want to other them. Like you said, we want to turn them into the monsters. And we're going to banish the monsters. There's nothing more primal and frightening as a human being than to be driven from the tribe and to be banished. To be banished, I think, is the most, probably the most horrendous sort of punishment to give another human being, is to drive them away from humanity. And yet every year that's what we do to thousands of people. We're saying we're dehumanizing them. We're saying that they don't deserve our humanity. And I think one thing that we need to think about, as some of us, I think a lot of us in this room probably identify as liberals, is we need to really be brave and courageous and examine our own susceptibility to those myths, the myths of the monster, and our own roles in perpetuating mass incarceration and how we've gotten here.
Earlier, you used the word redemption as something to think about, and maybe we can get back to that. I'm thinking about redemption on one side, which sounds like it's, at least as you used it, I thought you were talking about the person who has been incarcerated. And then, David, you were talking about safety for communities as being part of the argument. I guess I wonder, what are the other arguments for a prison system, and are any of them convincing?
Well, that's it. Do you want to jump in on that one?
I mean, the arguments you really hear are based on public safety, incapacitation, deterrence, the idea that somehow if people know they're going to be incarcerated, that will deter crimes or mandatory minimums. I mean, it's really about controlling and creating this idea that we're going to be safer by removing people from society, locking them away, disconnecting them, and then forgetting about them. I mean, that's really the hope. That's why prisons are built far away from urban centers. It's very hard to communicate with individuals once they're incarcerated. And then the legal remedies and options for individuals who are trying to move forward with challenging their convictions or whatever is also very daunting. So, I mean, I think it really rests on this fundamental myth of public safety. And it only is able to happen because we actually know very little about our criminal justice system. We have very little real information about what's going on, about the people who are incarcerating, about the policies and practices of both law enforcement and prosecutor's office. The way this has sort of been able to explode over the past couple of decades is because we have failed to ask very deep questions. And if there was, in my opinion, any other aspect or segment, part of our society in which we had a system with the failure rate and lack of efficiency and the costs that are associated with incarceration, we would long ago have removed it or said, we cannot, this is not sustainable or functional, it makes no sense.
Absolutely.
There's this, hell yes. There's another piece that I think helps drive the notion that the current system is what it is we need, and we need more prisons. We need to be harsh with people, And like, when you said that, hey, like, look, let's talk about folks who actually have committed crime, right? Like, it's not that harm isn't being done out there in the world, but then like, so there's this notion of accountability oftentimes is brought up and connected to, well, part of what the criminal justice system is doing is holding people accountable. And to be clear, like, I actually think that accountability is a very important value. I want, like, not just because someone has broken a law, right? Like, if I am inappropriate and I've hurt someone's feelings, I should take some accountability for that, right? Like, accountability is a good thing, but the way that it has been distorted, right? The notion of accountability, the way it's been distorted to advance the idea that we need more criminal justice, more jails, more prisons, harsher sentences, longer sentences. It's like, really, there's a difference between accountability and punishment. And the truth is that our criminal justice system is really about the punishment paradigm. It's not about accountability at all. And so, but you have the people who are out there stumping for the policies of mass incarceration, saying things like, we need to hold people accountable. Well, what they're talking about is not accountability. Accountability is when people acknowledge the harm that they've done, that they show some remorse, that they've taken some effort to repair the harm if that's possible, and people who do the hard work to transform their lives so that they don't create that harm again. And to be clear, punishment is not all that, right? It's passive. It's like the only thing that you need to do to accept punishment is to not escape it. And our criminal justice system is fundamentally about punishment. It's not about accountability. It's almost the opposite of accountability, because incarceration doesn't force people to acknowledge the harm that they've created, doesn't give people a shot at repairing the harm. And when you lock people in cages, to be clear, there is nothing to allow people to do the personal transformation to rebuild their lives, to be better on the outside. So like, we talk about accountability, but that's not what's happening.
Absolutely.
Rene,
I think one thing that I've observed a lot is there's in some ways it's kind of this virtue signaling that goes on. We think that in order to be against crime and against violence and for the victims, that we cannot allow any recognition of the humanity of the offender. But we can. We can hold the incredible, and I've experienced that growing up the way I did. We can hold the trauma and the pain and the deep need for hearing and listening and validation of the victim in one hand, and we can also hold the humanity of the offender in the other. These things are not contradictory. Yet even in our culture, I think people of all political stripes have bought into this myth that in order to validate the victim, they have to dehumanize the offender and say that they are worthless and will never be fixed and never be okay. And I'm speaking as a survivor as well as somebody doing my work. That doesn't actually help the victims. It doesn't give us what we need. We need to feel that what happened to us mattered. And if what happened to us mattered, then our society will engage in prevention and will engage in actually keeping it from happening again. Not just locking everybody up and thinking we're going to throw away the key. And meanwhile, when we get into those conversations, who gets locked up again? It's not Woody Allen, It's not the privileged, it's not Brock Turner. It's not the privileged white guy who is actually out there still free to commit horrible offense after horrible offense. Those are not the people that are actually getting locked up. So I think, I agree. It's not, what's happening now is not about accountability, and we also need to confront that it's really not about helping victims either. And I believe that if we create a victim-centered approach to justice, a restorative approach where it asks the victims, what do you need? And gives the offender a chance to change, that would actually do more for people like me.
Bobbin, yeah.
David and I are both reaching for the mic.
Good job.
You know, building on both what David and Rene said, I think, you know, David was talking about this language that we use, accountability and punishment. Rene is talking about this divisive sort of zero-sum game that's been created by proponents of mass incarceration. This is intentional. They create this confusion using these types of languages and this type of division. And I sort of call it the trifecta thing that proponents do. One, they try to shame individuals who have committed crimes by defining them as their crime, rather than looking at sort of the human, the complexity sort of that brought them into the justice system. They oversimplify that individual. Two, they take data, not good data, and just a sliver, and put it out of context and try to demonstrate, oh yeah, this is actually working. I had a district attorney not too long ago tell me that mandatory minimums have actually helped with racial disparities in this state. And that's not what the data shows. But he was looking at just a portion of it and stating that, and then when you hear it, people believe it and get confused by it. And the third thing that proponents will do is do this thing what Rene is talking about, is this idea of this zero-sum game, that in order to have real justice, you know, it's about the victim, and you have to punish the defendant. You cannot look at the humanity of the defendant. You cannot treat that person with compassion or dignity or respect, or think about rehabilitation or a restorative process, because the victim will suffer. And when you combine those three things together, what you end up having is a confused sort of community, confused population, and people then sort of go with their emotions. And it's understandable. And so I think now with sort of like the proliferation of, you know, social media, technology, being able to track information better, we're actually able to penetrate past that and have deeper discussions about criminal justice issues, criminal justice reform, and actually say, no, you know, don't be confused, don't be sort of, you know, I don't know, bedazzled by, you know, this kind of rhetoric, but let's get to the heart of what's going on here.
It's been amazing to see how much ugly criminal justice policy has been advanced in the name of victims. And the truth of the matter is, actually, the system does very little for survivors of crime and survivors of violence. There are very few options, there are very few choices, and there are very few people in the system asking crime survivors what it is they want. It's like in this country, over half of the people who are victims of violence, so people who have experienced serious trauma, who have been assaulted, who have been raped, people who have, you know, spent serious time in the hospital, choose not to report their crime. And to be clear, that means essentially that they're choosing nothing over everything that our system has to offer, which is not much for people. So it means that we actually really need to change our emphasis on prevention and on actually providing the programs that help people rebuild their lives, which is not what our system is focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's so many laws that have been passed as victims' rights laws, but really they're about police and prosecutorial power laws. And they're usually laws that have vast inroads into the civil rights of defendants and the rights of people for things like, you know, to not have the police come search your house without a warrant. You know, there's a lot of times what's couched as victims' rights is not. And I've had the same experience. You know, it's interesting because even working in the public defender's office and in working with defendants, a lot of times victims, you know, and I work with victims too, a lot of times the victims would tell me that they couldn't get anybody at the DA's office to pick up the phone. You know, a lot of victims report that they feel devalued in the system too. Absolutely.
And one thing I do want to make clear is that when we're talking about people who have experienced crime or trauma, when we began to look at the population of individuals who are incarcerated, whether youth, women, and men, what we find is actually a very, you know, a lot of these individuals have severe histories of trauma or assault or being victims themselves, and the justice system does very little to recognize that. So we're not talking just about people who, crimes have been committed against, but the individual defendants have also been, in a lot of instances, been through this.
We
Yeah.
call that in the work I do, especially the death penalty work, there's just a handful of investigators that do this kind of work, and we call that the myth of the Hannibal Lecter. And we have an ongoing joke that someday we are going to meet the brilliant sociopath that is, the stereotype, the boogeyman. And we're going to call each other and say, I found him. Because it's a myth, the idea that I think what happens is it's also deflection, because the idea that the reason so many crimes go unsolved is because there's a handful of brilliant sociopaths that are out there outwitting the police at every turn is just not true. The reason that so many particular crimes go unsolved, particularly against women and children, is because our society doesn't care about us. And the focus, thank you, the focus of mass incarceration is not on those crimes, actually. It's usually on nonviolent property offenses and those sort of crimes.
So I feel like there are two directions we're going, and one is that perpetrators of harm, who are sometimes called criminals, we're talking about how they're often victims of both specific individualized harm and larger social harm beforehand. And so one big question I guess I have is, what's the right intervention point into that cycle of harm done and then kicked out again? And maybe we can start there. Does that question make sense? And I'm thinking, even when I think about your two novels, for example, I feel like, in a way, the toughest characters to develop empathy for because of some of the things they've done, the more we get to know them, the more we realize that they've had awful things done to them, both specific things and larger social forces operating on them in a way that you almost can't help but empathize then with the harm they're doing to others. Where is the right place to intervene, and how much can we expect of a criminal justice system?
I mean, we need to focus on something different, right? I mean, hurt people hurt people. But we're not investing in, there's not treatment on demand in Oregon. We're not investing in mental health services that are accessible in a community-based way. We're not investing in addressing in the ways that we need to homelessness. In fact, we're criminalizing mental illness and homelessness. And when you think about the fact that in the past 20 years, the Department of Corrections budget in the state is one of the fastest growing state agency budgets, let's take a little less of that and invest it in the community-based programs that are actually going to help people be okay, have opportunities, be able to repair the harm. But there are choices that we can be making that are honestly fairly straightforward, and we just need the political will to be able to make them.
So I want to follow that up, and I guess I want to, what are the fairly straightforward choices that will help us repair some of the harm that occur to you?
I think, one, and to the credit Kate Brown, our governor, recently, for instance, there was a wonderful kind of coalition of forces that came together, including actually people that often work in jails and prisons. And in my experience, I spent a lot of time in jails and prisons, and actually, one thing that we need to address, that people that work in corrections are the blue-collar workers who used to work in places like timber, and auto. And so she's actually, they've passed bills decriminalizing, for instance, a lot of drug offenses. So, I think one of the things we can do is continue to push, particularly at the state level, where it's very doable for the decriminalization of a lot of offenses that are putting people in prison for things like mental health issues and addictions. I mean, these are things that can and have been accomplished very easily. So one thing that we need to do is pull back on mass incarceration. We really need to get rid of the mandatory minimums. They've caused so much damage. And I just, as a quick aside, one of the ways that mandatory minimums cause damage is they cause a lot of people who are innocent to take plea deals because they know that they're gambling, and I've had this happen to so many clients, and it's heartbreaking. They're innocent. They know it. I know it. But the DA is able to say, you're looking at 30 years. And the DA comes to them and says, and the DA knows this too, let's be honest. And the DA says, you know what, if you accept a plea deal for 7 to 10, you'll be out. So the client knows they have to roll the dice. Are they going to take 7 years for something they didn't do? Are they going to go to trial and potentially risk spending the rest of their life behind bars? And we have a lot of innocent people in our prison system because of these severe sentencing laws that we continue to push for. I think in those times that we're angry and we feel helpless, and we read about some high-profile case that sounds terrifying, and we think we're going to do something about it. But that high-profile case that sounds terrifying is not the man that's going to go to prison.
I mean, I think there are some clear things that we can do. I don't know if they're simple. I think first and foremost, we as a community, as a country, need to embrace complexity. I think that is going to be the biggest challenge, is to be able to say, you know, that people are complex, and our justice system needs to reflect the fact that people are complex. And that does mean getting rid of simple solutions like mandatory minimums, the death penalty, and other types of sort of 3 strikes. You know, these are all very simple-minded sort of ways to approach sort of our problems in our society. I think the other thing, which is a huge challenge, is we have to connect the legacy of racism, slavery, white supremacy to our criminal justice system. We just have to accept it and acknowledge that it permeates everything in our system. And that is not something we've done yet. It's not something in this state that we've accept. I mean, you have elected leaders that get tongue-tied and, you know, will say 100 different things except that was racist or this is racist. You know, it's remarkable. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. And I mean, we have district attorneys who deny racial disparities in our criminal justice system, or that institutional racism exists. I mean, just last week here in Multnomah County, and I'm sure this was just an oversight, innocent mistake, it wasn't malicious, but prosecutors were hanging 3 headless dummies in a courtroom next to a jury box that were wearing the clothes of African-American defendants that had the pictures of African-Americans on their chest. Now, I can see how they were trying to show these are the clothes that people were wearing, but when I first saw it, the first thing that came to my mind was a lynching. And this was next to the jury box. And so along the way, there's these sort of death by 1,000 cuts, kind of these racist things that happen that we just don't acknowledge. So I think, for me, those are the things that we have to start with. We have to start with those, you know, 2 things.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that, and I just wanted to build on that for a second. So on complexity and racism, thinking about those 2 things, I mean, we need to acknowledge that there's also this kind of notion of the good victim and the bad victim that is highly racialized, and also in policies and laws have been built on this kind of like ugly bifurcation that continues the cycle of holding people down. So for example, what do I mean by this? There's federal dollars out there that circle around to municipalities to provide victim assistance. There are people who don't have access to victim assistance. And for example, one of the things that prevents people from getting access to victim assistance is if you have a prior felony record. So a sex worker can get brutally assaulted, and if they have a former felony conviction, are they going to get any victim assistance that might actually help them be safe, to put their life back on track? No. When, how do I say this? So if you're young men of color are 10.5 times more likely to be robbed or assaulted than white women. But if you've ever taken one of those implicit bias tests, right, where the objects flash on the screen and you have to do a split second, who is this person? Who's the victim in this situation, right? But we don't think of young men of color as victims of crime But in fact, it's communities of color who experience the highest levels of crime, and so they experience a double burden in the criminal justice system, where they experience the highest levels of crime and violence, and yet are brutalized by the very system that is meant to protect them, because mass incarceration is ravaging communities of color.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
So where do you go for help?
yeah. Well, so it's interesting, Rene, when you used the word redemption before, I heard it in terms of individuals who were being incarcerated, and now I'm thinking about the system and whether the system can be redeemed. What would it mean for the system to be redeemed? And if we can.
And you know, I think that for whatever, when we talk about, you know, the cultural kind of climates and things, and you know, one of the things that I think that we all need to really wrestle with is our own defensiveness as communities, our defensiveness and our sometimes our unwillingness to see our own complicity in this system. And that's part of that beautiful complexity. And we, you know, I think of mass incarceration as the way that liberals often hold the gun. You know, we are complicit in this, and there is no shame, and there's everything powerful about saying we need to change. You know, we need to stop abandoning our communities of color. We need to, you know, whether it's, you know, practicing integrated schools, whether it's, you know, being engaged and confronting our own biases. You know, I think that we need to move towards redemption for us as a society, because we're all in this together. And so I see it as a collective effort, and I believe that we have the power to do that. It's not too late.
And Bobbin, when you talked about how you came to be aware of sort of the prison system, you said early in that comment that once you looked, you couldn't look away. But I think one thing that seems to be pretty clear is many of us are well practiced at looking away. So I guess,
I mean, I think this is the whole sort of disgusting thing about mass incarceration. It happens out of sight, out of mind. We often, you know, don't see it. We're not exposed to it. There's a very intentional effort to keep the things that are happening in prisons and jails hidden. There's a very intentional effort to keep information about what's happening in our criminal justice system unavailable or not even collect it so we can say we don't know. So I think it becomes easy to become complicit in a system that you don't see, don't hear about, and can't understand. Like, you don't understand what's happening to people. And I think often what happens is it's people who have family members who end up getting touched by the system that then get exposed to it and then say, oh my God, this is what's happening. I mean, I've been having some very interesting conversations in the past couple of months with faith community across the state, with Republicans, mainly because they've had family members or friends who have been touched by the system and gone into the prison and said, sort of like, what the fuck? You know, like, what is happening here? And I think sort of the brutality that you get exposed to, I mean, like David said, you're putting people in cages, and it's a very scary thing. And I think also what's really interesting that's been happening over the past few years, and which has really pushed this issue in the mainstream, is our cell phones. I mean, we're capturing stuff that's been going on in this country for decades, and it's being exposed to the public for the first time. People cannot deny that these things are happening, that young black and brown men and women are being murdered in the name of public safety. They've been saying this, we just haven't been listening. Now they're like, yeah, we got proof. You know, so I mean, I think that's it. It's just we have to do a better job of listening to folks. But I think it's very intentional. It took a lot of creativity, it took a lot of imagination, and a lot of sort of like thinking to create the system that we've had. And it exists because people want it to exist that way.
You know, if I can add on to that real quick, you know, because I spend a lot of time in prisons, and what you're saying is, you know, is so true. You can drive an hour and a half, 2 hours out of Portland and go, you know, the state's filled with prisons. And it's like a whole nother world. It's a world inside of our world, and you can walk into these places and there's thousands of people. And they've been erased and vanished, and they're largely people of color. And it's, you know, it's just this astonishing, sad thing. And this story I was going to tell real quick is every now and then I get calls from reporters. And this just blows my mind every time. I'll get a call from a reporter saying, well, I really need to get into Snake River. I really need to get into OSP. They start naming prisons. And you see, prisons have rules against journalists going in. That's how closed off we have allowed this system to become, how much we are hiding ourselves from the truth, that we have allowed these prisons to say journalists cannot even come in. So I get these calls from reporters saying, well, can you tell me how to get into this prison? Because I'm a licensed investigator, I have access. And I say, I can't get you in. And the question I always want to ask is, like, how many decades now have you been not trying to get into this prison? How could we collectively let this happen? The atrocities that occur. I'm just going to be really frank. I mean, there's a group of inmates that recently very bravely came forward to file a lawsuit about the prison rape gangs that staff are complicit in. You know, the brutality, the deaths that don't get recorded. You know, and we put children in these places. You know, it's just, it's so horrifying, and I agree. I mean, I just wish we need more pressure to, you know, we should have reporters in there. We should have people in there. We should be minding what's happened to our own country.
And to be clear, Department of Corrections and Prisons are public agencies. Mm-hmm. Public agencies, so we should have the right to know what's going on in there. We should treat them like every other government agency and understand precisely like what's going on with every dollar, how people are treated, mm-hmm. And how people are acting in those prisons. But it's one of the few agencies that we just say, yeah,
whatever.
You know, whatever.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, to this a very like kind of individualistic and kind of human battle that we need to have for ourselves, because you know, violence happens, and it's a natural human reaction to feel like someone should be punished. The way fear is actually also a very human emotion, and the policies of mass incarceration have definitely been sold on the politics of fear. But I think that we need to challenge ourselves when we see ourselves responding in that way. Like, in some ways, it's about, like, do we have optimism for human evolution? Can we do better? And if so, we individually need to actually push ourselves to lift up, to tap the compassion rather than the fear and, like, the support for the punishment paradigm when we actually see something terrible happen. And to know that, like, no one should be judged for the worst thing that they've done or that the worst thing that they've had done for them, and to have faith that, like, as people can transform. And if we're building a system that fundamentally doesn't believe that people can transform, then we've already lost.
Absolutely.
And I just want to say, because I don't know if people actually understand the size and scope of when we say mass incarceration. There's, you know, numbers out there, 2.3 million people who are incarcerated, some other 8 million that it's on some sort of correctional control. But we have over 5,000, or I saw the stat recently, 5,000 jails and prisons in this country collectively and across the country. So there's nothing in modern human history that sort of can compare to this. Mm-hmm. There's more people in prison in the United States or under correctional control than was in the gulags under Stalin. More people of color, black men incarcerated here in the United States than were enslaved. I mean, this is phenomenal when you think about it, that in this country that we have this kind of system of incarceration.
You know, and jumping into what you're saying, I think that one simple thing that we can do is to, when we have those feelings of fear and rage, and I think a lot of times we feel helpless. And so we think, I feel helpless, I'm gonna get on social media and start calling for this or doing that, and we start pushing for these things. And so one thing that we can do is to kind of stop ourselves. You know, when we have those feelings and we start thinking that the answer is to call for even more and more draconian penalties and stiffer and harsher sentences, we can be the one that's not jumping on the bandwagon And we can be the one that's saying, you know what, I bet you anything if we pass a harsher law against X, Y, or Z, it won't be enacted in the way that we imagine. And just to give you a quick example, you know, we go through these phases where it's very popular to get our society to get very angry and upset about a crime. And a lot of times it's mythical, like the myth of the wilding super predator boys that was never truth, or ritual satanic abuse is another example. A while ago, several years ago, it was really big to be angry about identity theft, and we passed these really severe laws about identity theft, that where now people who are, say, drug addicted and steal a checkbook from you can go to prison for dozens of years. You know, so we need to stop ourselves. When we have that natural result, that natural human emotion of fear and anger, I think we can stop ourselves and say, is this really what we need?
So, go ahead, sorry.
And I think that's a really good point, because I think a real recent example of it that occurred here in Portland, and this is really hard, is the tragic killings that happened on the MAX train.
Yes.
You have an individual who is, from the liberal or progressive perspective, evil. You know, someone that just committed these horrendous, terrible acts. And it continues to put himself and speaking out, you know, just sort of awful rhetoric. It is a death-eligible case. The prosecutors are going to seek the death penalty against this individual. And this is where I think these tensions really kind of come to be for folks that are, you know, who are liberal, who are progressive, and who sort of want to do this criminal justice reform work. But when we confront something like this, our initial reaction is, yeah, you know, this guy is terrible, you know, and it has split, like, some of the people that, you know, that we work with, that, you know, in the community that say that are just silent on the issue. And so it's a very real thing, and it's a very hard thing. So, you know, again, we're talking a lot about how bad the system is and what it stands for, but it's complicated. It's not easy. You know, these are tough emotional issues to work on.
And it's also, I think it's easy, you know, that in that particular case, you know, that's, you look at that person that committed that offense, and there's a long history of all the ways in which we failed. And executing him is not going to stop white supremacy either.
But it does feel to me like the complexity of this is one thing. The difficulty of holding these things together, on one hand, an intense skepticism about the size, scope, and duration of the justice system as it is, and at the same time, a hope that we might find it within ourselves to start turning this around. And it sounds like there's some hope in technology, there's some hope in other things we might see, but it feels more than complex. It feels incredibly challenging to look through. In a way, the more we see, the harder it can seem to come out the other side of it. So I've heard moments of what sound like optimism or hope, and I want to ask for help seeing those.
Well, recently we hosted a speaker, and he was talking about, over the past couple of decades, we've just been outspent, out-organized, and he was saying, you know, it's as if we were going against an army or a tank, you know, and we were running with a spoonful of water and trying to defeat that army with that spoonful of water. And by the time we run and get there, you know, the water's all spilt out. So I think, for me, the hope is you know, I think we are having a very sort of soul-searching spiritual conversation about how we punish, who we punish, racism, white supremacy in this country. It is a battle that's happening. I feel hopeful because I think we're finally beginning to start talking about the root causes of some of this. I feel hopeful that we are actually starting to talk about the right institutional actors and their sort of, and how they've perpetuated this system over the past couple of decades, like district attorney and local officials. When we say a criminal justice system, it's not a system. It's a bunch of individual actors that work in silos that sort of keep pushing things along. And we are sort of wakening up to, okay, we have to start attacking all these institutional actors putting pressure on them to change and demanding culture change. And we have to start spending money, and we have to start organizing better. So for me, all those things are starting to happen in ways that haven't existed before. So I feel very hopeful that, okay, we're finally reframing the conversation to where it needs to be. We're starting to put resources where we need to put them. It is a mountain we still need to climb, but I think we're finally like, okay, finally getting to, eyes wide open, this is what's happening.
Awesome. Totally agree. I actually tend to be a pretty optimistic person. I think, when we get out there and we grapple with things, we stop feeling so helpless. And we, in my work, I see so much sadness and tragedy, but I also just see so much strength, and I see humans trying to survive despite the most terrible odds, and it fills, my soul. And I feel happy about that. And I want to say that the kind of things that make me feel really hopeful and optimistic is that now people like myself are on a stage, and we're being listened to. So thank you, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think I would actually build on the piece around increased awareness, and I will just say, right now, the activism that's happening in the country and in Oregon around prosecutorial reform is huge.
Yes.
The most powerful people in the criminal justice system are prosecutors and district attorney offices. They define more than anyone, more than judges, more than police, what happens to someone in the criminal justice system. They have largely defined their success based on metrics like how many convictions they have, the length of sentences they convict people to, and to be clear, those are not the benchmarks for whether or not they're adding to helping to build safe and healthy communities. And so right now, there's a movement happening, right, that says we need to redefine the role of prosecutors in our criminal justice system and totally change the benchmarks. And by the way, most of them are elected, so we have power over them, and we're beginning to shine a light and pay attention on them. And I think that's going to actually create some serious change.
Yeah, I think looking at district attorneys, sheriffs are elected, county commissioners are elected, mayors are elected. All these folks at the local level have more power and control over our criminal justice system than anyone else. And we can put pressure on them in ways that just hasn't been done before. These are actors that have largely been ignored. But to David's point about district attorneys as the most powerful actors, it is incredible when we as advocates or people, advocating for reform, talking about having this conversation and demanding a conversation around criminal justice on a level playing field, just demanding that level playing field is a threat. They feel so nervous and so scared and push back, saying, how dare you demand putting attention on us? How dare you demand fairness? How dare you demand us showing you what we're doing? And they have been operating in a way that is this asymmetrical relationship that prosecutors have all the power when it comes in the criminal justice system. Defense attorneys are largely, negotiating with them. They hold all the cards. It's this culture, this asymmetry, and when you challenge that asymmetry, it's really remarkable. It's kind of scary, but it's just like this remarkable thing that's happening that district attorneys don't know what to do. And they say all these incredible things and push back in these ridiculous ways.
It's interesting. I'm aware first that in a moment I want to open up for questions, but I also want to ask, in part because of, I think, Rene, your comment about who's up here, and now we're talking about people that aren't up here, that are part of the conversation and part of the system, and I want to ask, what would be the best question that a district attorney could put to you as you make the case you're making? What are the questions that you think are the really good penetrating questions that, were there a district attorney on stage with you, that person would be raising?
While being raised of the district attorney?
By. Not of, by. Yeah. I want to try to, if it's possible, to go, okay, to attribute sincerity.
Well, yeah, it's very important that we don't, I think that, recognizing all these things, again, I don't think any of us here are trying to say they're the monsters either.
Sure.
I think most people that get into this kind of work are well-intentioned, and they have been, unfortunately, kind of spoon-fed a diet of television and all these other things that create these monster myths and these sort of things. And a lot of them, I think, there's a lot of hostility in reaction. And like right now, one of the things that we're pushing for too is pay parity, because DAs tend to get paid 3 or 4 times what somebody in my position. We joke it's indigent defense, which means indigent pay. And so that just creates a huge disincentive for people to do my kind of work. It makes it really difficult. It devalues the work. It's very hard for decent attorneys in particular to stay doing this kind of work. So, I would just start from the premise that they are, probably very well-intentioned people that need to be having these conversations with all of us.
Yeah, I guess to be fair to district attorneys, they're the most powerful people in the criminal justice system that we have a lot of critiques of. And so they need to take some responsibility for the status quo. But that said, because they do have so much tremendous power, they have tremendous ability to make positive change. And so I have a sense that we're not gonna be able to change this unless they join us. So I don't want actually to be oppositional. I want them to be in collaboration with us to critique and to change the system, because we need them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that helps me, maybe that helps me frame a question badly put a moment ago. I guess I want to ask, if you had to boil down the question we ought to walk out of here thinking most about, and when I say we, I mean we broadly, whatever our role is.
Well, you're going meta.
It's a tried and true, maybe not always effective, but...
I reject the premise of the question.
I knew that was going to happen.
What happens if I accept your rejection? It's complicated. We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but I really do want to ask the meta question, whether you consider it meta or not. And
The question that we would ask people to...
the question you'd like us to... I think there are a lot of things already, clearly, that we... all of us are grateful to you for getting us thinking about. But if you... to boil down and go, what's something you want us, as we're going to sleep tonight, to be thinking about, an open question that you want us thinking about?
I can't really think a question. I would say that, I think that we all have the power to make immense change. And one of the things that we do in our society is we devalue that. Women in particular, I think, we're socialized to be afraid and told that we're helpless and that we need some other person like the criminal justice system to take care of us. And we're not that powerless, and I think we all have this capacity and ability to make a difference. And a lot of times it's even the smaller things that we do. Checking in on the family down the street, volunteering, trying to tackle these issues with integrity. So I think for me it would just be that recognition of that power and that capacity that we all have, and it's something that we can all share in this journey. And every movement, the civil rights movement, for instance, there are the people that are the protesters. There's the people that are the lawyers. There's the people that are doing my kind of work, and then there's the people that are doing other kinds of work, and it all has value. We all can make a difference together.
Go ahead.
Well,
We're afraid of you.
I
now
think
that
it's
you
building on some of the values that both Rene and David talked about accountability, punishment, redemption. Most of the people, 95% of the individuals that are incarcerated are going to come back into our community. So I think we have to fundamentally ask ourselves, what is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? And I think from my perspective, it has to be restorative. It has to be rehabilitative. Our goal as a community has to be to lift up people and to help heal. And that is not easy. It's a very, again, complicated thing to do, but I think that's the question we need to begin to ask ourselves. Because once we start asking ourselves that question, then I think the whole frame of the conversation shifts about what is the purpose of the criminal justice system? What do we want our prosecutors and defense attorneys doing? What do we want our law enforcement doing to help ensure that if people are sort of violating our social contract, what things are we doing along the way to make sure that that's not going to happen again? And we're not having that conversation. We haven't really started that conversation in a meaningful way.
Thank you.
I guess so where I would go with it would be, I mean, I think that, first of all, social change is oftentimes a slow process. And we can get lost in the path of incrementalism. And sometimes, if we're really going to reimagine justice, we need to resist pushing back on rejecting ideas that seem overly idealistic or impractical or seem too far away or maybe not viable at all. And sometimes it's healthy to let ourselves imagine. And so just in the spirit of Angela Davis, who wrote this really powerful book called Are Prisons Obsolete? I would ask that we allow ourselves to imagine, what would our society look like, even if it's 80 years from now? What might it look like if we didn't have prisons and jails?
Thank you. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to have us shift to questions from this microphone over here, and that I know it can feel like a lot to get up and walk over there and ask a question, but I want to encourage people that have questions to get ready to ask them. While we're transitioning to that, can you join me in saying a big first thank you to David, Rene, and Bobbin? So no shortage of questions. As we go to questions, given the line already, I do want to make a request, which is to try, please, to keep your questions fairly succinct and interrogatory.
So before we jump into this big line behind me, I want to ask a question from Twitter that we had come in during the program. Why has Measure 11 and mandatory minimums been so hard to roll back in a progressive state like Oregon?
Ooh, good question. You wanna-
So why?
Why has it been hard to roll back the mandatory minimums in Oregon?
Yeah, and Measure 11.
I don't think we're as liberal as we think here, to be honest.
That was a simple answer.
Sorry, just got to, yeah. I think that's it. I mean, I think that, for one, Portland is sometimes a little blue bubble in a big, very conservative and very poor state. But yeah, liberals, I think we really need to get off of our high horse and think that we're somehow not racist and somehow not complicit in this. And, people politically are very much afraid of seeming soft on crime, and we really have to get our politicians in particular past that hurdle and support them when they do make these efforts.
And there's another, this is maybe a little bit more of a kind of policy wonky response, but when Kevin Mannix put Measure 11 on the ballot in 1994, he also put something that I refer to as Measure 11's sneaky cousin, Measure 10 on the ballot. Measure 10 also got passed. And what Measure 10 says is that essentially any criminal sentence passed by a vote of the people needs a 2/3 vote of the legislature to change it. And to be clear, a 2/3 vote is a really, getting that many legislators to agree to anything is really, really hard. It's a higher bar than they need to pass new taxes, and that has been a colossal barrier to be able to create change at the legislature.
Thank you. Why don't we go ahead?
I was going to say just
Sorry,
one thing.
Bobbin, yeah.
I was going to say it's just the politics of fear and anger. I think at the end of the day, what ends up happening, proponents of these punitive sentences and mandatory minimums will share the most horrific stories, and I think all of us then begin to react sort of with our emotional self when we fill out our ballots or when we vote. And so I think that is a very hard thing that we have to accept and recognize that, many people probably voted for Measure 11, not really fully understanding it, but just heard some stories about it. So I think, moving past that politics of fear and anger and soundbite politics is really important.
Thank you.
Sally Jochen. Could each of you say one or two things that anybody in this room who isn't already working on criminal justice, something very specific that they might do in line with all the things that you've said?
Thanks.
Email your district attorney. If you live in Multnomah County, it's Rod Underhill. If you live in Washington County, there's a contested district attorney race, so you actually get to decide who your next district attorney is in the next few months. And let them know that you want, as a voter and a constituent, you want the district attorney to embrace an emphasis on treatment, on prevention, to reject mandatory minimums, to stop treating youth as adults, but whatever. Communicate what it is you want in the criminal justice system, because that person is accountable to you as a voter.
Yeah, absolutely. The power, just adding on to that, we sometimes imagine people like district attorneys as like these rarefied creatures that live in another world, but they are our employees, and the power of an email or a letter is actually very significant. They pay attention, they're elected officials, and I think that, that's one thing I would definitely suggest is start getting active with your communications, and again, what you believe and is important to you.
Hey, Bobbin, 1 second. Oh, and by the way, if you want to actually figure out who your DA is, you can go to theyreporttoyou.org, which is a campaign website around district attorney accountability, theyreporttoyou.org.
Thank you.
So David didn't take the opportunity, but as an executive director of a nonprofit, that's a very dangerous question to ask, because I will say donate. The DOC budget, just to give you an idea, is about $2 billion per biennium. That doesn't include law enforcement or county costs towards jails. Organizations like David and Minds operate, anywhere from, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $8,000 to over $1 million or whatever operational budgets per year. So we are really holding a spoon of water trying to fight this mass incarceration. All right, so I said that.
That was well done.
And I'll just say, talk about this issue. Stand up. Don't be silent about this. Talk about it with your friends. The only way this changes is through culture change. And culture change happens when you convince the people around you that this is not the way to do it. And that's the only way to sort of really reimagine and change the system. We need a culture change to happen.
All right, my name's John. I'm an organizer with Oregon Recovers. We're trying to move towards, getting away from the criminalization of addiction. Also a person in long-term recovery and formerly incarcerated. So I've been a victim of the plea bargain as a child, and was threatened by the DA that I could get up to 20 years for a drug charge. And so I spent some time as a juvenile, and I also spent 6 months as an adult for a drug charge that I ended up getting sentenced to 20 days for. So I understand the criminal justice system. My question is, I understand the benefits, the small benefits of the plea bargain, but I'm wondering what we can do to get away from this manipulative tactic to scare people into pleading guilty. What do you think the alternatives would be for the plea bargain to get away from that?
Thank you.
I'm really glad. I don't know, did everybody catch that question? About the plea bargains. This is a very frightening, I think, statistic, but in Multnomah County, I think 95% of all cases are settled in plea bargains. And, working particularly in public defense work, that's scary. And so one of the many things we need to do is push for that parity to support, for whatever reason, I won't go into it. I think defense attorneys are kind of maligned. And people that do defense work are very often misunderstood. So we desperately need to support an equitable system where people doing my kind of work can actually have the time to investigate and to support clients, and the attorneys have the time and ability to fight back as well against that system. And I'm so sorry to hear how you suffered.
So that stat that you provided is actually pretty representative of what the reality is across the state. So about 95% of all cases, criminal cases in Oregon, in all of Oregon, are resolved through a plea agreement. And the majority leader, Representative Jennifer Williamson, in the short legislative session in February, introduced a bill to put actually significant limitations on the ways that prosecutors can get people to sign away their rights inappropriately within the negotiation process. It did pass. It was significantly scaled down, and I think in 2019 there will be a robust effort to pass a bill that puts significant sideboards on what prosecutors can do in plea negotiations, and that will be something that our organization, the ACLU of Oregon, strongly supports. It's never too early to talk to your state legislators to support that.
I mean, I think we just need to also demand transparency. I mean, the truth is plea negotiations happen in secrecy. I mean, between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, but there's not really an understanding of what happens, how it happens, how consistent they are. And so we need to demand transparency about this process, and that will force change. That will result in, I think, meaningful change.
Thanks.
Yes, my name is Judith Armada, and I'd like to thank you for all the work that you do, and I'd also like to thank the audience for taking the time to come out tonight and be interested in this, because it hasn't always been that way. One of the areas that we haven't addressed, and this is one of the hardest to address, is the monsters of the monsters, and that's sex offenders, and what happens to them, what we've done with sex offenders without protecting victims. But what we've done is established a whole other legal system for them, and much of it happens after they have finished serving their time, which is registration, notification that they're in the neighborhood, residence restrictions, job restrictions, and other sorts of things that happen. So that's a hard one to take on. I know it's the last thing anybody wants to take on, but I would love to hear your reaction to that.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm willing to step into that one. You know, sex offense laws are really excellent examples of how somebody will come up with a law and everybody says, that's a great idea. Let's, for instance, have sex offender notifications. And people think that sounds great. We'll know where all the sex offenders live. But then, of course, the law gets enacted and the outcomes are actually often much different. Sex offenders then end up getting driven from neighborhoods. And I want to clarify real quick, a registered sex offender, only a small portion of those people would be considered, like my stepdad, a serial sex offender. Many times, in times in which homosexuality was against the law, people that were convicted of sodomy were sex offenders. Consensual underage sex work allegations, convictions, all these, there's a lot of people who are convicted sex offenders are not your boogeyman monster kind of myth. But what's happened with these kind of notifications is we've driven a lot of people who are convicted of these offenses underground. They can't find housing, they're kind of exiled again, even though they're no longer in prison. And I should add again, also people end up plea dealing to crimes of sex offense they also didn't commit. That happens too. So even potentially innocent people too are part of this, and they're being driven from our communities and being driven underground. And instead of looking at the actual possibly dangerous sex offender who's still actually living in your neighborhood and what we can do about that, we're dealing with like this massively problematic system where people are becoming homeless and they're certainly not getting treatment and they're certainly not being monitored. So the actual outcome of notifications has been completely the opposite of what we've tried to do. We've actually we've made it so these people actually are not being monitored because they're underground. And that's I think, very problematic.
I would say that this is actually not that. The issue itself is what I often say is like the third rail of issues, even for criminal justice reform advocates. But if we're really willing to embrace, again, this complexity and science and good information, this is not a hard issue. Most of the policies that have driven sex offense sort of policies, laws, how we treat and punish individuals who are convicted of sex offenses, is just driven by fear, anger, not good information or science. When you begin to look at the information and science, the policies and the treatment of individuals who are convicted of sex offense don't make any sense. It is overly punitive. it's just junk science that, not even junk science, but it's just bad information being sort of driving these policies. And I think it's a hard one because emotionally it's a tough crime, obviously, that's occurred or potentially may have occurred. But I think if we're really willing to sort of ground ourselves into the science or the information, then we can find that this is not really that hard of an issue and that there's much better solutions to this issue, to individuals convicted of sex offenses. And I think what Rene said, further isolating them and exiling them is far worse. And this is sort of the super predator of our time. I mean, this is the myth, the monster that exists in our society right now.
Thank you.
Carol, with a real short question following up on David's charge to us to imagine what a radical change in our justice system might look like. What can we learn from other countries, other regions, other states that's worked well?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, you know, there's, if you're talking about actually, there's a lot of wonderful role models in other countries. I mean, we've become so isolated in our system here in the United States. It comes as a big surprise. I was recently actually in the UK, and it always startles me to go to other countries, which is pretty much every other country, where if you're convicted, for instance, of murder, you might serve 10 years in a prison and have treatment. That's actually the role model of what Pee-wee calls a civilized nation. So the United States has gone so far in this kind of, this what feels to me like this genocide hysteria of these severe sentences. And actually, if we look at other countries, the far more moderate sentencing focuses on rehabilitation. These things, again, you look at the science, they've proven to work. I think we've just been very resistant to hearing that. And that is, in itself, I find just absolutely fascinating. Like, where does that resistance come from? Mm-hmm.
There is an amazing, amazing restorative justice program in Brooklyn called Common Justice. Mm-hmm. And I think that they were the first restorative justice program designed to support victims of violence and people who have actually committed that harm. And what it does is well, I don't want to actually provide really lengthy explanation, but I'd say if you're interested in restorative justice models, which are the best, or the closest thing we have to really imagining something fundamentally different, look up Common Justice on the internet. They're doing cutting edge work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm April McFerrin, and in fact, I'm a lawyer in formation. I just wanted to thank you, Rene, Roger, and Bobbin, Adam. You all left me with two very, very valuable, a valuable paradigm and a valuable question to bring into me as I began, preparing myself to enter into this system. Mm-hmm. And that is what, the paradigm of accountability versus punishment. That's an amazing paradigm to carry in because that really, is the core question. What is a criminal justice system? And that was so articulated well tonight. And also, I was left with a question that I think is going to absolutely be the central question that I will probably be spending my whole profession answering, and that is, what is justice? And I really want to thank you, Rene, for putting it in those terms. What is justice? And I also want to say, Rene, that as a woman and as a survivor, me too. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all of you.
Thank you.
Deborah Resley, thank you. I was introduced to David earlier through another presentation that you gave. I had a quick question, a couple of questions. One, on the issue of making people more aware, is the press here tonight, and will they report on this?
If the press is here, would you raise your hand? There's some sort of new media in the room.
Okay, good. Okay, good. The other thing is, I did contact my DA's office, Rod Underhill, about the issue of non-unanimous juries and mandatory minimums. And I'm a geologist. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know, I don't have answers to all of these questions. And it's come up that the group I'm with, that's part of my church, really needs something like a pro forma letter that people can sign up on that will really make an impact to Underhill, because I was told that we need to write letters, and if you ask people to write individual letters, it's not going to really make much of an impact. So do you have something? I looked on your website for the ACLU and I couldn't see any kind of thing like that, a tool.
There is actually an action alert on theyreporttoyou.org that allows you to email your district attorney, whatever county you're in, and I think that could be a helpful resource.
Yes, I've been on there, but I didn't see anything that I could sort of co-opt to sort of summarize, and something that I could speak to the DA about that would actually be impressive for him. But
Can we take it?
maybe I can contact you later on.
And
that
we can.
issue.
I think it's a useful suggestion as well, and
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And the other quick thing is, how do we address pay parity for defense? Because why do they have 400 people on their caseloads, and there aren't enough people there to
Yeah, I think that has to happen at in the state level too. And there has been a push on that. I'm not quite sure what the issue is. A lot of that is just educating people and educating our politicians as well. I remember talking actually to Kate Brown about it. She was nice and came and visited the public defender's office, and she seemed genuinely shocked when she heard about the pay scale. So I think that's one thing that we need to do is get that information out. A lot of people in the general public are not aware of that horrible disparity that discourages so many young attorneys and people from going into the field.
Is there a website we can reference, or can we reference the work you're doing, or?
For me?
Yeah.
I have a website that's about my work and my writing. It's, if you're interested, it's www.renedenfeld.com. It's just my name. You Google my name.
Okay, great.
It has an email button too, so if you want to get in touch with me, just hit that email button.
All right, great.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
On the issue of pay parity, I think it's important to remember that the state funds public defense through the Office of Public Defense Services, so it's state funded, whereas district attorney's office are largely county funded. So to get the state legislature to actually allocate funds for defense is harder than county commissioners sort of rubber stamping public safety dollars at the county level. So I think one way to start forcing the issues is start engaging with your county commissioners, so start asking, to get them to ask the DAs, why do you need so much money? What are you using your money for? Justify these line items, and that just doesn't happen. And so the DA presents a budget, the county commission approves it. So I think, there's other ways than just simply asking the state to give money, but I think we need to start asking why the DA needs X, Y, and Z, or this amount of money.
Very good point.
Hi, my name's Tori. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight, having this very important conversation. So I just wanted to ask, as a lawyer and organizer and as a survivor, the era of Me Too has in many ways felt very empowering, but as a criminal justice reform advocate, it sometimes feels like we're moving a little bit backwards at the moment, I think because of the tendency towards fear and anger that you guys have kind of discussed. And so as much as I sometimes understand the urge to throw the whole man away and start over, I know that the threat of criminal consequences actually keeps abusers and rapists from taking accountability for their actions. And I think I speak for a wide variety of people in Portland trying to do more restorative community accountability work. So I guess my question for you guys is, what can we do about people who refuse to take accountability for the harm they've caused right now? Because I think for people who are willing to do the work, there's avenues outside of the criminal justice system, right? But right now, I think it feels really difficult to figure out how to address the situations in which people aren't.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Well, first of all, the Me Too movement is so powerful, and I feel like this could be a transformative moment in our society where we're really raising the bar and saying, like, hey, like, look, there's all this behavior and engagement and harassment and assault that is fundamentally unacceptable, and as a society, we're not going to take it anymore. And if I hear your question, I mean, I think that one of the things, well, first of all, in terms of the hope for the evolution of the Me Too movement, just like the criminal justice reform movements have evolved, is having a sharp conversation on what does accountability look like. But to your question, what is that heard is like, hey, how do you actually hold someone accountable when they're actually not acknowledging the harm? And you know, it's interesting, like when people are in denial, like what do you do, right? Like what do we do with a prosecutor who like doesn't think racial disparity exists in the criminal justice system? And I think that in that instance, the best tool that we have is to like name and frame, to be able to say like we see you, this is what we see happened, like, you know, and it's the kind of unveiling of, so that people have to confront it.
Yeah, you know, and I think that I agree. The Me Too movement is immensely powerful, and the way I feel is it's kind of a big roar in a way, and it's a chance for victims to feel heard finally, and that's I think what most of us really want is we want to feel heard, and we want to feel that what happened to us mattered and people care. There are times when the person that offended against us isn't taking accountability. And that's, you know, certainly what happened in my case. In my personal experience, then, when that person doesn't take accountability, that's when that anger, those are normal feelings, that anger, that fear, that rage comes into play, and we think, I'm gonna punish this person. I'm gonna either put them in prison or ostracize them or do something terrible to punish them. And it doesn't work. And in the end, what we can do for each other, and I think this is why Me Too is so important, the validation and the hearing and the love and the care we need, we can find it with each other. We don't have to always think and say that that offender has to be punished. We can get that from each other, and we can give that to each other.
We should just take these last three questions fairly quickly, and then we'll, again, encourage to stay and keep talking, but let's keep the formal thing for just these last three quickly, yeah.
My name is Kayana, and I was a public defender in Alaska for almost 4 years, at which time I represented over 2,000 clients. Wow. And in that time, never once did I see something that approximated justice in any way. And when I spent years thinking about why that was, complexity was really the issue, whether it was the beat cop on the street who was engaging in racial profiling, or when he was supposed to protect and serve, he was really just hunting black men down the street, shooting him, and then getting administrative leave, which amounts to paid vacation. Whether it was how we treat something and fancy something up called white-collar crime that really cost taxpayers millions or billions of dollars in golden parachutes and no prosecution, compared to something like property crime that might cost somebody $100 or $1,000 to repair a car window. You see across the board, it's on the cops on the streets, it's the judges in the system, it's the DAs, it's the legislator. And so my question is really about incrementalism. You know, the biggest example of incrementalism I saw in my time was the federal disparities between cocaine and crack were 100 to 1, as if cocaine wasn't just bought by rich white men and crack by people who couldn't afford the cocaine, as if crack came from the crack fairy instead of just being stepped on coke. And when we spent time and energy and finally got the chance to have a hearing on this issue, we addressed it by reducing it to 10 to 1, as if 10 to 1 was equality, if 10 to 1 wasn't disparity, as if we didn't know what equal meant. So my question is, do you really think, any of you, that there's hope for change to the current system we have, or Do we need to just start over? Start with a system that recognizes racism that exists on every single level, of how when I try to explain to my client that the laws don't apply to the people in power equally and why that is, and why a victim who's coming to me, because I do answer my phone and I do talk to her and I do guarantee that she will have a place in court because I will call her to be able to talk to what she wants to have happen at sentencing. Do we just start over? Because it's so broken that incremental change will always be some sort of just bone that the other man is throwing us.
Yes. I think what we have failed to do, and I think what David was talking about, is we can't be afraid to just be bold, be imaginative, and be creative, and talk like that, and say it, and be confident in what we're saying, because it's true. You know, the facts, I think, are on our side. You know, the data is on our side. We live in a community, in a state, in a world in which there are political realities, so I think incrementalism is just a natural byproduct of that. But I think what we have done a very poor job of is being okay starting off with a bold idea and then negotiating from that standpoint, or working from that baseline. I think we too often start at what's politically real and then negotiate against ourselves to something that's compromised. And so, you know, we really do need to be imaginative. We really do need to be creative. We really need to think and say out loud the things that we're saying. The system's racist. You know, it disproportionately impacts people of color. Not disproportionately, but it brutalizes, you know, the people that go through the system. And not be afraid. I think that's the biggest thing. Is like when we say words that are that provocative, we say, oh, that maybe offend someone. Good. It should, you know, and so that for me, I think, is the big thing that we should embrace, that imagination and big thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think when as you know this, you know, you had a couple thousand clients in just a few years. Those of us that are engaged in the work, it's very easy to kind of develop a trench mentality. You're just trying to fight through one case and one day after the other. Which is why we need this community of people that are having these conversations and people saying, you know, and I perhaps am radical enough to think that I think we could get rid of prisons and jails tomorrow and we would be okay. We'd be better than okay. Just think about the incredible intellectual and creative and imaginative power that right now goes unfound and unexamined. All these people in prison and what they could do for our country and our economy and everything. I mean, these people, they're not just other humans, they're resources that you know, we could use.
Yeah, we absolutely need to build new models. And like I talked about this program before, Common Justice. I think that the degree to which we can create restorative justice models that are fundamentally different in terms of they're survivor-centered, they are about real accountability. And if we're not building those, we're never gonna have anything different. So we need to create like working models that are fundamentally different.
And if I can add real quick, if for those of you that may not have heard the term restorative justice before, I've done some of these cases, and just kind of in a nutshell, and victims uniformly tend to be very happy with this process. It's victim-centered. The victim and the offender come together in these mediated conversations to give a chance for change and to have the victim receive what they need from this process. And there's different kind of models for it, but it tends to be very effective.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alice Shapiro, and I've been in public education as an educator from doing pre-K through community college for many decades, actually. So my question, I have a couple, but I'll keep it brief, is how do we get the money, how do we get privatization out of the prisons? Because we can see that the more anything is for profit and benefits the privileged, the more it's going to be perpetuated. So how can we work towards ending privatization of prisons and then get some of that big chunk of money into our public schools? It looks like we're getting to be way at the top of incarcerating people, and we are number 48 out of 50 in educating our children. That's the bottom of the pile. So the question came out from you folks as to When do we start educating people? Kindergarten or below, and we're trying to do restorative justice in schools, public schools, but without the funding and without a good teacher-to-student ratio, it's not going to happen. And I think a lot of it is because of privatization. So how do we stop privatization?
Thanks.
That's my question.
I mean, we were talking a little bit about this before we came on stage, but mass incarceration, it is money-driven. It is profit-driven. There is a lot of money in mass incarceration. And while we don't have private prisons here in Oregon, there's a lot of contractors that are making a lot of money off of mass incarceration. So I think, you know, we really have to start being strategic in how we attack this and going after the money and countering it with our own resources and money, to be honest. And then the education and incarceration thing, there's a direct link. I mean, there's a direct link between having an undereducated population and being very high in incarceration. So it definitely has to be a reallocation of resources into our public education, generally speaking. And it starts with, I can't really say, but it's a great question in the sense that I think they occupy the same space, and we have to start thinking about it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just add, you know, the ways in which it's not just prison slave labor. Like, you know, Oregon is, you know, theoretically we don't have private prisons, but what we actually have are these shells, these buildings in which these private companies come in and exploit the inmates. And it happens in medical services. It happens costing $10 for a phone call. You know, you name it, there's all these predators. They're not monsters, right? But there's people that are exploiting that, and I think there's a lot we can do just in terms of awareness and moving against that, because, you know, if we took the profit out of this, we wouldn't have such a motive to incarcerate so many people.
So, and
That's true.
Absolutely. And maybe to like take this out of Oregon for a second, I will just say that, you know, nationally, the biggest area of growth for the private prison industry has actually been for-profit immigration detention centers. Yes. And there's a huge intersection between privatization, the advancement of mass incarceration, and the horrible predatory immigration policies of our country and the Trump administration. And there was incredible success, actually, by people who are focused on trying to put an end to the privatization of prisons in this country. There was a serious shrinkage, and then Trump got elected. And within a few months, actually, the stock value of the private prison corporations skyrocketed because they knew exactly that Trump was going to butter their bread. And so we need to also be paying attention to the intersection with immigration policy and join the fight to push back on what's happening right now, the tragic things that are happening around immigration and ICE.
Thank you. Why don't we go to the last question for the evening here?
Yeah, my name is Howard Shapiro. I'm the other side of Allie. To carry that question a little further, that was going to be part of my statement. You didn't address that. However, what is the effect of this privatization on any change that has to take place will go through the political system? And the campaign funding will come from the corporations that stand to lose anything. And so many corporations, food corporations, in addition to what you mentioned, will stand to lose, and they're going to put money into campaign, and so there goes your change. How do you get around this conundrum?
Well, that's I think exactly why prior to the election, a lot of big businesses supported Trump, because they're invested in this prison slave labor economy. And, you know, I think I'm sure everybody has other ideas. You know, I think that there has been some kind of initial pushes at just disseminating the information and boycotting, and there's a lot of ways in which I think we can have impact on big businesses and as far as consumers, and letting them know that this is, you know, obviously the situation's not tolerable. I don't know if anybody else has.
I mean, I think we have to demand transparency from our public institutions, the prisons and Department of Corrections, and understand the huge amount of the money that corporations are making, the contracts that are happening, and how corporations are making money, and how it's exploiting people who are incarcerated. I think what's also something to be very aware of, and I think is very dangerous, is that these companies are smart. And so, for a long time we talk about alternatives to incarceration, probation and stuff like that, and corporations are like, hey, you know what, we can make money off of ankle bracelets. So let's start pushing more alternatives to incarcerations too that keep people under supervision. So we ourselves have to be careful about what we ask for and how it may be also pushing these companies into making more money. Like we've been talking about, for a long time, non-lethal force for police officers. Well, taser, like multi-billion-dollar industry right there, like using tasers and stun guns and things like that. So, and people are being brutalized by that weapon now. So there is money at every aspect of this, and I think we have to be also very cautious as we're thinking about new ways to keep people out of prison, how we may be also complicit in continuing this sort of profit motive or money incentive that's driving mass incarceration.
So here's what I want to do. I want to first of all say a huge thank you to the three of you for your work and for helping us think about both complexity and ways to enter into this more fully. So please, everyone, a big, huge thank you.